there, I'm Beau Dixon, Artistic Associate at Fourth Line Theater. Welcome to the Sizzlin Series, where we celebrate extraordinary citizens of the Kawartha region who reflect our racial and cultural diversity. Up next, we have Chet Singh, educator, political activist, dub poet and recording artist, and a dear friend and former bandmate of Dub Trinity. Let's go say hi.
Yeah, that's it, yeah. Yeah, I like that. That's good. The revolution was postponed because the revolutionary leader had to reschedule a meeting with his ethical investment funds advisor. The revolution was postponed because the revolutionary timetable conflicted with the deputy revolutionary leader's liposuction surgery. The revolution was also postponed because the secretary of the revolution filed a sexual harassment grievance against the revolutionary leader and the masculinist hierarchical power structure of the revolutionary bureaucracy. The revolution was postponed because the Revolutionary Council did not meet its managing diversity targets. A diversity consultant was brought in to set up a revolutionary affirmative action program. And finally, the Revolutionary Council was concerned that the revolutionaries were not working to maximum revolutionary efficiency. And so the Revolutionary Council hired an organizational change consultant who promptly diagnosed the problem. The revolution had to be more nimble. The revolutionary workers needed empowerment. The revolution needed proper branding like "We are the world," or the Pepsi Revolution, or "We can do it," or something like that. And finally, the revolution needed an employee assistant program for heroes of the revolution who were disenchanted with the revolution. And so the Revolutionary Council promptly devised a 5-year revolutionary strategic plan. Downsize the Revolutionary Middle Guard, give the lower Revolutionary Guard more responsibility, slightly longer hours for the same pay so they could be empowered. And finally, and probably not lastly, the revolution was postponed because the revolution's ethical investment funds had such poor returns, it was decided that the revolution should be incorporated. To put itself on a more solid financial footing, the revolution is now a reality TV show starring postmodern gurus of the counter-revolutionary army. This message was approved by the Revolutionary Committee on Revolutionary Propaganda. My name is Chet Singh, born in Jamaica, Caribbean raised, lived in many different islands, including Fiji. Been in Canada for a few decades now. My parents left Jamaica. The same year, actually, Marley got shot. What was happening in '76 was you had a socialist prime minister about to be reelected. CIA didn't like that. It was still the Cold War. They unloaded a couple of ships of heavy-duty armaments. 2,000 people died in that election. So, you know, we're by virtue of American imperialism, we had to leave. It was, very violent at that time. So my parents, sent me to school here. My father didn't stay here, but I went to school and then went to Trent. It was a very interesting place at Trent because I'm coming from a background where I have a consciousness that is probably different than most people here. My cultural socialization was very much influenced by reggae and Rastafarianism. And that's what I was listening to. Not Bob Marley so much. When I was there, it was more like the DJs, like Big Youth and Iroy. I mean, those are the people I was exposed to. But it was still very much an anti-colonial expression. Jamaica achieved independence, but only in name. It was still a colonial state. Wrapped up in the economic apparatus of, capitalist imperialism. So there's very little the local politicians could do. You had Manley on the left and Siaga on the right. So I'm growing up in this environment. And so from a very young age, I have a political consciousness. How I got into dub poetry was really an act of activism. It was part of my activism. There was this event called Cultural Outreach, and I was looking at it, and I'm like, this is like the whole this is the multicultural trope. It's okay. Look at the exotic other. Look, this is how we dance, and this is how we sing, but it's taken out of its cultural context, right? Because a lot of this stuff fits within a very specific cultural context that has meaning, depending on the activity. Whether it's a birth, death, whatever. And so I decided I'm going to disrupt this. And so I got together a couple of punk musicians, and I was going to do punk music to poetry, just to mess it up a bit. What ended up happening was a band, right? Because these punk guys wanted to learn how to do reggae, so I became like a reggae pseudo-punk band. When I left Trent, Lillian and I and Prof from York, I was working at York at the time, Carol Yanni, who's since passed, we met for 2 hours at the United Church down on Queen Street. Lillian had an office there, and we planned what was the first international dub poetry festival. We had 60 dub poets from around the world. And what was very interesting about the dub poetry movement in Canada, that was somewhat different than, I would say, Jamaica or even England, was that even though it was an anti-colonial expression, in Canada, dub poetry was very intersectional. I would say right from the very beginning, like myself, Lillian, and a couple of the others, for us, it was not just an issue of race or imperialism. It was capitalism, it was gender, it was sexuality, class. It was all of these things. It was where we fit into the colonial narrative here within Canada itself, right? Because around this time, First Nations are like part of the multicultural mosaic. They're not the original people, and in essence, our migration is also helping to displace them even further, as they have been for the last 150 years. I mean, why do you have immigration? To grow the economy, capitalism, keep us consuming, buying, right? The more people come, more cars, more houses, more tuition, et cetera, right? So dub poetry was looking at all of this stuff and looking at the way in which we were being treated in the society, by the police, by the educational system, and so on. It's, dub poetry is not about posturing. It's not about, if you're going to say something, that's not enough. You have to engage it, right? So dub poetry is how we live our life in a way. It's a consciousness, it's an awareness about your place in society, your place in relation to others, and what you can do to make yourself better and the society better. In essence, that's what reggae, Bob Marley. I mean, that's what I took from reggae and reggae culture. So the educational system is a battleground for us, and that's why. I mean, I would say. Before I got into teaching and I got like a tenure type gig, I was fired from all my jobs because what I was doing was working as a change agent within the system. But, as long as the system is controlled by the dominant groups, what you can do to change is very limited. There's the area of cultural change. The attitudes, the mindset, the norms, the racist, sexist norms, the homophobic norms. But then there's the practical aspect of change. How do you actually transform the institution itself? How do you get people into meaningful roles so they can truly contribute and shape the organization or the organizations? For us, many of us, this is a big battleground. I performed dub poetry I started doing that in Peterborough. It was more out of my sort of activist sentiment than art, so I consider myself both. I would say most dub poets do. We have a particular analysis of society, and so we work to change society to be more equitable, inclusive. I would say dub poetry in Canada is different than dub poetry elsewhere because it's very intersectional. Issues of race, gender, class, sexuality, these are all very important to many of the dub poets I work with, including my mentor like Lillian Allen. So I also teach, and I've worked as a human rights change agent within the system, and the system doesn't really want to change, and it won't change as long as it's controlled by dominant groups. What I find, it's this process of resistance and the dominant groups recouping their power. So I don't do that anymore. I'm a teacher, and I find being in the classroom is important because what I get to do is disrupt the dominant discourses and narratives about what is Canada and who we are. After I left Peterborough, you know, in the mid 1980s, you had a succession of black people being killed by the police, right? And I'm working with the anti-racist educator, my mentor in the educational system, Enid Lee, at the North York Board of Ed, and Jane and Finch. You know, that area was one of the schools I would go and work at. And what I was noticing was that, you know, a lot of the teachers were almost scared of black youth. They'd bought into this narrative of the, you know, the bad black kid, and it was like they were giving up on them. So I was noticing some of this, and looking at how that might affect them, you know, post education. And I was looking at what we were trying to achieve. You know, by then we had gone from multiculturalism to race relations, and we were trying to push anti-racism, and the teachers and administrators were reacting very badly. You know, when we did things like the history of Canada to look at colonialism, imperialism, the displacement of the First Nations, they would tell us, hey man, you guys are communists, Marxists. We would get comments like that. To the point, we had to get a white guy, Bob Moore from the United States, to come and do that segment of the race. It was called the Anti-Racism Awareness Series. So out of that experience came Jane and Finch. I finished writing it then, and I wasn't playing with a band or anything, but Lillian used to invite me up on stage once in a while, and she'd invited me up, and that's when I first performed that piece.
It was a black sky night, not a star in sight. Babylon boot steps, crunch soft snow. Outside the Jane and Finch disco, DJ Chalice rocking the palace, drum and bass bubbling, brothers and sisters skanking, a rhythm of historical yearning, catching the memory of an ocean breeze. Small.
My approach to this work is you can't be a bureaucrat from within the system. Right? You have to involve community. Community has to be part of this process because they're the ones that have been excluded. They know how to create inclusion.